Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name's Eric Alexander. I'm the Executive Director of the Brigham Education Institute, and wanted to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this second in a three-part series that I'll have Dr. Ramani more formally introduce, but I want to thank also Dr. Frambach for being with us today and leading this second session.
Thank you, Eric. And it's really a pleasure to have contributed to the design of this three-part series on qualitative research by popular demand. And I think a lot of our local educators wanted to learn more and actually clarify their assumptions or perceptions about qualitative research. So we had a three-part. We did the first part where I introduced people to the study design approaches, and we even went through some study questions. And we are continuing, and I went through the steps of qualitative research last time, and I warned everybody that steps are never linear and are more circular. You keep going back all the time. And then today, Janneke Frambach is going to be our expert leading data collection and analysis. So it's and in fact, it's something I've learned a lot from her during my own PhD at Maastricht University. So Janneke is an assistant professor, researcher, teacher, and educator in health professions education. She coordinates a PhD program at the School of Health Professions Education at Maastricht University and manages also the international partner programs of the Master of Health Professions Education at Maastricht. Her areas of expertise are globalization, cultural perspective, cultural diversity in education, and truly an international expert in qualitative research. Thank you. Over to Janneke.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Shubha. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. Hello, Kamar, for example. So this is the second session in the series on qualitative research in medical education. And you may wonder why this illustration of dancers, actually it was an illustration that I used in my PhD dissertation designed by a friend. But I use dancing also as a metaphor sometimes for qualitative research. And so I'm not the only one, I think, using this metaphor, as this quote may show, just as the dancer relies on the spine for the power and coherence of the dance, so the qualitative researcher relies on the design of the study. Both are elastic. This may seem a little bit abstract to you at this point, but I hope that this quote will become a bit clearer during the rest of the hour. We'll come back to that. First, I wanted to start with, well, Shubha already asked you to introduce yourself briefly in the chat. I also wanted to see quickly who's in the room when it comes to the experience that you bring in qualitative research. So I'm going to start actually with something unqualitative, that is asking a multiple choice question. So please, put in the chat whichever is most applicable to you. Is this your first acquaintance with qualitative research? Have you read about qualitative research before, or perhaps about a qualitative research paper? Have you been involved in a qualitative research project of others? Or have you designed and conducted your own qualitative project already? Or you've already conducted multiple qualitative research projects, or something else. So just to quickly see who's in the room, I will try to monitor the chats. I see some C, B, E, D. Okay, so quite some experience already. I didn't see an A so far, so that means many of you, I see C, D, E, many of you have already been involved in qualitative research. So I'm also inviting you to share your experiences during this hour. and use those experiences to also respond to some of the questions that we'll discuss, because I also have some questions for you to discuss. Let's see, maybe in addition to the previous question of your experience, is if you would like to share any of your goals, challenges, or questions that you would like to see addressed in the session. I will try to do so, but cannot promise, because it's quite challenging to talk about rigor and data collection and data analysis in just an hour, but I will try my best. So if you would like to reflect on your goals, challenges, and questions and put them in the chat, you're very welcome to do so. And you can also do that throughout the session. And I'm also trying to monitor the chat as we go. All right, so today's goals are to talk about rigor in qualitative research. And I've put down basics here because I think this session is really just an introduction to that. And then also about making informed decisions when choosing data collection methods. So from rigor, we'll move to data collection methods, and we'll end with talking about some of the steps involved in qualitative data analysis, specifically thematic analysis. So let's start with rigor. And I'm sharing here a last page that was published already a decade ago in Academic Medicine. And I think in session 1, you also talked about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. And this last page actually introduces quality criteria, so thinking about quality and rigor in qualitative research as compared with quantitative research. And you'll see then that there is a different language involved. So there are criteria that focus on quality in qualitative research, but they are not the same. We don't talk about validity, reliability in qualitative research, but we have different terms. The principles behind them, though, they are more generic. So that would be the orange boxes in the middle here, about the truth value of the evidence, the applicability of the evidence, the consistency and the neutrality of the evidence. So those are also things that we think about in qualitative research, but they are expressed in a different way. For example, the truth value of evidence, which would be internal validity in quantitative research, we would call credibility in qualitative research, where it's about the extent to which the study's findings are trustworthy and believable to others. And in the right-hand box, the green one, the dark green one, you'll see a number of techniques that you could use to actually enhance quality in qualitative research. Now, I'm also looking at the chat as we go, just to make sure I don't miss anything. I will share the slides also after the session, so no worries about that. Now, the disadvantage of this particular last page, as I've come to find out in the last 10 years, is that especially those coming from a quantitative or biomedical paradigm or approach to research sometimes tend to use this as a checkbox. So using the techniques that are in the dark green boxes and say, okay, I've done this, I've done that, check, check, check. So now my findings are credible, transferable, and dependable and confirmable. Check, I've reached rigor, or I have achieved quality. And that is not the way it works, I would say. It's about integrating these techniques in ways that work best for your design. And some of the techniques mentioned here, and I'm not going to go into detail in it in this slide, but we'll talk about some of them in some of the next slides. Not all of them apply to every study. So it's about thinking carefully of which of the techniques makes sense for your particular design. Personally, I'm therefore not really a fan of putting it in boxes like we have on this last page. I think it serves a purpose as a starting point, and I think it's a nice resource to look up for like a quick comparison between quantitative and qualitative research. But then it would be important to do further research into how could these be applicable to your particular study. So personally, I'm a fan of more overarching concept, trustworthiness altogether. Are my findings trustworthy to others? And that is a more overarching term that could be used for quality in qualitative research. Therefore, I am a fan of this particular resource, 8 Big Tent criteria for excellent qualitative research that talk about quality criteria a bit more holistically. So I'll take you through this table. Basically, this article states that there are 8 end goals for qualitative research papers when it comes to quality. And that's the first column. And then the second column lists the means through which you could achieve these end goals. And they are quite overarching or holistic end goals, starting with a worthy topic. So a topic that is relevant, that is timely, that has significance for the field. It may be obvious, but I think it does belong in the quality criteria list. The second is rich rigor, and that has then to do more with what we often see as the more technical part of the research, involving the data collection and analysis tools. For example, rigor could be enhanced by allowing to spend sufficient and appropriate amount of time in the field. If you investigate a phenomenon, an often phenomenon in our field are complex phenomena to observe or to understand. You're not going to get that by one day of observing in a clinic, for example. Now, sampling is another thing to think about when it comes to rigor, and I will expand more on that later in this hour. What are the contexts that you choose also as a part of sampling? What are the contexts that you choose as your research sites? And then which data collection and data analysis tools do you select, and how do you use those? So that is something for part 2 and 3 of today's session. The third end goal would be sincerity or authenticity, meaning it should be clear where your findings come from. And that means being transparent about your own assumptions about the phenomenon. So reflexivity, and being transparent about how you moved from the words of your participants to the findings, the themes, or the conclusions that you drew. And reflexivity is key in this process. And my next slides will also unpack that a little more, because I think that is the key aspect to me about doing qualitative research. The fourth one, credibility. To what extent are your findings credible to others? You could achieve that by something called thick description, meaning describing your research context, your research setting, and your findings in detail. Because it's not a goal to generalize our findings. We want to enhance the transferability of our findings. So to what extent can these results maybe be applied in other settings? That is not up to you to decide. It is up to the reader of your article to decide to what extent are the contexts comparable to their contexts, are the results that you describe in detail comparable to their situation, and then they might judge for themselves to what extent your findings are applicable to their situation. And you could achieve that by thick or detailed descriptions. Triangulation would be, it originally comes from the field of navigation, where you try to, I lost the English word. You try to navigate a point on a map by triangulating different points. And in research, we translate that by, for example, including multiple perspectives, multiple researchers in one research team. They have different perspectives on a phenomenon and therefore can contribute different sites, different viewpoints. Triangulation could also refer to different data collection methods, like combining interviews and observations. They will give you a different type of data, because you'll often see that what people say could be very different from what they actually do. Multivocality, meaning giving voice to the show, actually being transparent about the different voices that are in your participant group. So there might be one participant who has a completely different viewpoint than others. Even if it is only one person, it would be also important to give voice to their views on your phenomenon. Member reflections. I think that's comparable. Member checking, maybe that is a term that some of you may have heard, is giving your findings back to your participants, or giving the transcripts back to your participant and seeing to what extent it resonates with them. In this paper, Tracy advocates for, not for member checking, but member reflections. So giving your interpretations back to the participants to enrich those even further. Then the next one would be resonance. To what extent do your findings resonate with readers? This might be, I don't know, a little out of the box one or strange one. She puts here aesthetics, for example. Your results need to also be aesthetic in the sense that they are attractive to readers. Now, that is maybe not something you think about as the first thing when you think about quality, but it is a key aspect when it is about getting your message across. If something is not attractive, then readers also will not read it, will not be attracted to it. Transferable findings is what I already talked about. Does your paper make a significant contribution? That could happen in different ways. Conceptually, theoretically, does it contribute to a new understanding of theory or even new theories altogether? Is it practically relevant? Is it perhaps methodologically relevant? Quality also having to do with ethics, and there are different types of ethics, so thinking about ethics, the procedural ethics involved in the informed consent, for example, that we probably all know, but also are there perhaps specific ethical questions involved in the situation or in the cultural group that you're doing your research in, the relationships that you have with your participant, and how you exit the setting. So when you exit, do you make certain agreements with your participants about how the results could be useful for them? So all of that also you could see as belonging to quality of qualitative research. And then finally, I think another key one, meaningful coherence. And that is, do your choices align? And I think that probably in session 1, you also learned about that. It means selecting an approach that matches with the research question. I believe you already practiced with some research question and thinking about what approach matches here, but it's also going further down the line when you do your analysis to choose an analytical strategy that matches also with that approach. And that is something we will also talk about later in the session. So this is quite a full table. I would really recommend this resource to just read a bit more in detail. Now, like I said, reflexivity is a key aspect, and that means acknowledging the possible influences of you as a researcher and the assumptions that you have on the research. So in qualitative research, we do not try to be objective. We actually think everyone is subjective. Also, quantitative researchers, they also ask questions for certain reasons. They choose particular research questions and theories because they have perhaps certain assumptions. And in qualitative research, we try not to control that, but to actually embrace it and to be transparent about what it means for the research. So questions to ask yourself then are, who are you in relation to your research? Who are you in relation to your context? Are you an insider? Are you an outsider? And what knowledge does that give you? Who are you in relation to your participants? Do you know them? What relationships do you have with them? Who are you in relation to the theories that you use and to the phenomenon that you investigate? Do you have experiences with it yourself and certain opinions about it? And the research process and all the steps involved there. So this is something I would just want to kind of give you as a take-home exercise, is to start a research diary in which you, for example, list aspects of your identity and then try to think what aspects of my identity put me at risk for inserting bias into my research. For example, how I phrase my research question, how I use theory, but also which aspects might help me in my research. For example, getting easy access to rich data. I have critical friends that I could use. A research diary, I think, is key in qualitative research, where you not only start by reflecting on questions such as these, but then also as you move along, to be transparent about how decisions are made. So which decisions are made, which steps are involved, why were they made, what was the considerations that you discussed in the team, and the role of the assumptions that you already have. So someone then from outside could look at that as kind of an audit trail to see how the research came about. Now let's move to, with this in mind, because we'll come back to this as well, with this in mind, let's move to the second part, which is about data collection methods. And as you may already have discussed in session 1, qualitative data is naturalistic data, and the methods are designed to minimize data reduction. It's about generating rich data that is not coded or summarized or categorized or otherwise reduced at the point of data collection. So when we speak about interviews, for example, it's about exactly the words of your participants. That would be your data. So you would have the transcript with their actual words in not nicely flowing sentences, but really speaking language that you will then analyze. Now, to start with generating this rich data, you have to think about, who am I actually going to talk to? Who am I going to observe? Who am I going to involve as participants? And not only participants, but also research sites. So the settings of where you will perform your study. And in qualitative research, that is usually purposeful or purposive sampling, which is an intentional selection of individuals and sites to learn about or understand the central phenomenon, the phenomenon that you want to know more about. And here are just some sampling strategies listed. It's not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a sense of how you could apply purposeful sampling. For example, you would do typical case sampling, meaning you would just sample the most ordinary, usual cases, as opposed to deviant case sampling, where you would go for the most extreme cases because they maybe tell you something very important. You have a hunch about that. It's important then to be transparent about that you chose deviant case sampling, meaning it is definitely not representative for your population as a whole. Critical case sampling, it's maybe a little bit related to that. You choose critical incidents that happened, for example, because you predict that these would be information rich about your phenomenon. And maximum variation sampling would be kind of a combination of everything. So trying to sample for participants with as widely different backgrounds as you can think of, to maybe try to include as many different perspectives about the phenomenon that you are investigating. I often see this when I've used it myself, I think mainly this maximum variation sampling. Theoretical sampling is a term that originated in grounded theory research, but now is used more widely in qualitative research, where you as a researcher, your purpose is building or contributing to theory development. And theoretical sampling is a way of sampling in which you decide during the study of whom to talk to, because you will think that this participant may give you most or new perspectives on the theory that you're developing. So you're analyzing your data and you're building your theory, but you come to the conclusion that this part of my theory I don't know enough about yet. So I have to talk about other people. I have to talk to other people to know more about it. Maybe it's a completely new group of participants. And that would be then theoretical sampling based on your theoretical analysis. Snowball sampling is sampling that you talk to a participant and you ask them, do you know anyone else that may be able to provide rich information about this phenomenon, or maybe a completely different perspective that you know of. So it is someone suggested by another participant. So the snowball gets bigger, the snowball of your sample. And convenience sampling is pragmatic considerations take priority, such as sampling those that are just accessible to you, that you have access to. Or you cannot travel far because of resource constraints, so you'll stick with the ones that are in your local setting, for example. Now, in contrast to quantitative research, in qualitative research, the sample size or the sample frame is often not fixed, and it develops throughout the project. Like I just gave the example about theoretical sampling. It's an iterative process often, where you'll analyze and then maybe do more data collection. And sometimes you'll just then also change your sample as you go along, often until a certain point of sufficiency, earlier called maybe saturation, data saturation. Now we speak more of sufficiency. To what meaning? Collecting data to a point that you feel you have a robust evidence for the theoretical framework that you were developing, or for the themes that you were developing. Again, there are more resources about that, and I'm just going to quickly look at the chat. I think, Subha, thank you for sharing all those resources. And just in case I miss someone's question, then just shout out or raise your hand, and I'll try to respond. Now, about data collection methods. So I'll just give you an overview of the ones mainly used in qualitative research, and then try to focus that on why would you make choices for a certain data collection method. Starting with interviews, by far the most widely used in qualitative research. In qualitative research, those are not structured interviews. That has a more quantitative orientation, where you ask the same question in the same order for all of the participants and quantify their answers. In qualitative research, it would be semi-structured or unstructured. Semi-structured meaning you do have a guide of questions, but you don't ask the same questions to all of your participants in the same order. It is more conversation-like. And unstructured is completely conversation-like. You don't necessarily have a question guide but you have a conversation with your participant. Now, when is it a good choice to do interviews? It is a method that allows you to understand the world from the participant's point of view. You have the ability to focus on very specific topics. Unlike observations, you just have to wait and see what comes along. But in an interview, you can ask about something very specifically. And if you do one-on-one interviews, you can also talk about more sensitive topics. Unlike focus groups, where these are sometimes not a good idea when you want to discuss very sensitive or personal topics that you feel participants may not feel comfortable with discussing this in a group. Additionally, why do you want to do focus groups is to capitalize on the interaction between participants. So this would be your way to go when you want to see how people react to each other's opinions about a certain topic. You could use this in very creative ways. For example, giving a group a scenario and let them talk about that and see what it does to the group. Focus groups are not group interviews. There is a distinction there. A group interview would be me interviewing you as a group, and you would all respond to me as a researcher. But in a focus group, I would be more the facilitator and just give you some discussion items and let you do the conversation. And I would just facilitate. So that would be a difference. And in a focus group, you want to capitalize on that interaction. Observations, a common way of collecting data in qualitative research, because you can then actually see your participants and your phenomenon in their naturalistic environment, and you have access to what they do, which is sometimes very different from what they tell you in interviews. So it is not necessarily to check your interviews, but it just gives you a richer perspective. And then there are multiple other possibilities, such as maybe it's debatable to what extent this is qualitative research, but in an open-ended questionnaire, you also have, you could, for example, encourage your participants to give elaborate answers. And that allows you also to document their perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, or knowledge. You could also analyze documents, textual documents, whether they and often documents that already exist, such as policy documents that, for example, allow you to investigate changes in organizational views on a specific topic, to document the context of certain practices, or, for example, to use student assignments, such as written reflections, to investigate their experiences. So there are all kinds of creative ways. Even more so, you could analyze artifacts, you could analyze rich pictures, you could actually ask your participants to draw a picture about the phenomenon and analyze that. You could ask them to keep an audio diary. There are many creative ways, and there are obviously some resources available for that. Now let's practice a little bit. So here it's a bit artificial because I'm only going to give you the research question. But if you look at this research question, which method would you choose, perhaps, if you would want to contribute in the chat? So how do residents learn to perform complex technical skills on patients? Take a minute to think about that and maybe write down some comments in the chat.
Sorry, just to clarify, it's data collection method, right?
Yeah, so the interviews or the focus groups or the observations or anything else that was on the previous two slides.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have some different answers already. Observations, yes. Focus groups, direct interviews. So we have multiple answers, and it's maybe a little bit of a trick question because obviously there are different possibilities. I'm just going to show you here what these authors, this is from the study that is on the slide here, what they used. They did a constructivist grounded theory. I think you learned a bit about that in session 1. And then they combined that actually with observations, but also interviews and focus groups. They purposely selected the setting, which was a tertiary pediatric emergency department, which allowed them to really see this phenomenon going on in practice. And they did a convenience sample of the participants for the observations who were there at that time, but then they did purposive and theoretical sampling for the interviews and focus groups. So multiple data collection methods are possible for questions such as this one. I think the authors here did a nice job because of combining, doing this triangulation gave them a much richer picture about the phenomenon compared with doing only an observation or only an interview study. So it's a matter of choice what you go for. Just briefly, another example, how do residents experience their own well-being in relation to their professional and their personal life? So again, what data collection method would you use? Interviews, observations, focus groups, questionnaire. I see 2 responses of interviews already, 3, multiple, yes. It's interesting that this question immediately gives a more, I think, what's the word? You give more similar answers to this question. So let me show you what the authors chose. They did a descriptive phenomenology where they had indeed 13 in-depth interviews guided by semi-structured interview guides. And they started by asking who wants to participate and then continued by purposive sampling of reaching a maximum variation. And I think the reason why you named interviews is because they ask about how does someone experience something, and that happens inside of them, and you cannot necessarily observe that when you look at them. So then interviews would be your way to go. So you see the alignment here also with the descriptive phenomenology approach, which is about lived experiences and how your participants experience a certain phenomenon. So you could look at this reference later on to get a more detailed sense. But here we can then also see, if we look at the last aspect of this table here, meaningful coherence, you see the coherence between the question that they ask, the approach that they use, the data collection that they used, and the sampling that they did. So here we can see the rigor in practice. Now, considering the time, I think I'm going to move to data analysis. But I think I just put in these slides because qualitative interviewing, I think, is the most widely used qualitative data collection method. And yeah, my message here is it is an art, I think, and there are so many aspects involved in qualitative interviewing. So it is worth to dive a bit more deeper into it, but I'm going to make the choice now to focus on data analysis. Just want to give you this very brief glance of what a good interviewer is. And this is going to be a very full slide. Knowledgeable, structuring, clear, gentle, sensitive, open, curious, steering, but not leading, critical, remembering, interpreting, balancing, and ethically sensitive. So a lot of things to consider while doing your qualitative interview. And then we also have the interview guide. So asking a question, inviting a good interview question invites a rich, detailed answer, is broad but focused, often open-ended. It's not to say that closed-ended questions are forbidden, but often they are then followed by a prompt that invites the interviewee to elaborate more. So it does not lead the interviewee. So you're not going to ask like, so from other people, I heard that so and so and so and so. What do you think about that? It's more about asking more open before leading them into how others might think about something. Using clear language leveled to them, and obviously being aligned to the research question and in line with the methodological framework. So when you do a phenomenological study, which is about experiences, that your questions also allow them to talk about their experiences. So just to take that example of well-being that we just talked about, you would have to think about translating this research question into an actual interview question, into a guide of maybe 5 questions. Not 50, 5 are often enough to guide you through 1 hour of interviewing. It would, for example, could be asking them about their daily experiences, asking how they feel at the end of the day or when they drive home. So really something that allows them to share their experiences. So it's about always translating your research question to your participants' language and something they can relate to. Now let's, for the last 15 minutes, focus on some steps involved in qualitative data analysis. And I chose thematic analysis as kind of an example to go through that, because I think it's one of the most widely used strategies in qualitative data analysis. There are other techniques, but I think a lot of qualitative research involves some kind of theme development. Sometimes it's theory development. But yeah, I think this is a very general approach. It's widely used within a variety of paradigms and approaches. Its purpose is to understand experiences, thoughts, and behaviors. And what do we mean when we say themes? These would be actively constructed patterns or meanings that are derived from a data set, and that would answer your research question. Now, they can be generated inductively or deductively, or a combination of both. And reflexivity and transparency would be key in here. So I will also come back to this. Now, there are 6 steps involved in thematic analysis, and I'll take you through a worked example that is from a Resource and Amy guide, and some of you may actually be familiar with this already. But we'll go through these steps one by one. So the worked example is about a project that investigated experiences of patient ownership in a pediatric residency program, and it followed an inductive approach. So in step 1, that would be familiarizing yourself with the data. So reading through your transcripts, especially if you did not do the interviews yourself, maybe. So just take a minute to read this part here, which has the brackets. All right, so this is obviously a bit artificial, that it is only one small quote rather than a whole data set. But let's move to step 2, which is about generating initial codes. So you would look through that piece of transcript that you have, and you would then try to find meaning in there. And here are some examples. These authors, for example, listed physician feelings towards the patient as a code. And here in the coding manual, the blue line here describes what that code is about. It's about the feelings, positive or negative, that a physician has towards their patients. So that would be an example of a code you could ascribe to a certain part of this excerpt. Another one could be intrinsic sense of responsibility. And the authors describe that here as the sense of responsibility that a physician feels toward their patient, as opposed to requirements imposed upon them by attending physicians. And the third one is continuity of care, which refers to seeing the same patient longitudinally from the physician's perspective, or seeing the same physician longitudinally from the patient's perspectives. So they just, your first step would be to go through the text, and attributing meaning to what you see in there and giving labels to those things. And in a manual, you could then describe what do those codes actually mean to you. So what is coding? Naming segments of your data with a label that simultaneously categorizes, summarizes, and accounts for each piece of data. So you take fragments of the data and ask, what meaning do you glean from these fragments? It could refer to just one word, to a concept, to actions, to a whole bunch of things. Sometimes a code is one word, sometimes it's a sentence. So that is also about developing your personal style, I would say. Some tips from me personally is don't create too many codes. In my first project, I think I created a phone book of codes, but then realized this is too much and kind of downsize that to a much more focused template that I then applied to the other parts of my data. So you have to balance that a little bit. Structure your list of codes. It often helps to work with codes and then maybe some subcodes. But I would say 3 levels max. If you go to 5 levels, it's often better to split some of the codes. Maybe a note about data analysis software. You have a lot of software available that can help you with this process, but it's not going to do the work for you. These programs are for categorizing. It's easy then to split codes or merge codes or find codes in those systems. They help a lot, but the essence of the work, you have to do it. So I think you are the main tool in your data analysis. The way that I just described was open or initial coding for the first couple of transcripts, then maybe doing a more focused coding for the next transcript. So you don't have to code each and every word of your transcripts. I think it's a misunderstanding to say that if you have coded everything from A to Z, that you did rigorous coding. It's not about coding everything. It's about the meaning that is in the coding. So if you notice, I'm now working on autopilot in the coding. That's maybe the dangerous part where you say, okay, I'm not thinking anymore, I'm just attaching codes without thinking. But it's about continuously thinking, what do the codes mean? How do they relate to other codes that help you then in developing your themes and your theory? Just also to reassure you, there are infinite arrangements of codes, each tell a different story. So it's about choosing your story and being transparent about how you came to that, backing up with quotes. But maybe someone else would have found a different story in your data, and that's okay. It's not wrong. It's about being transparent about that, and ultimately so that others can learn from your perspective. Now, the questions to ask yourself while you code, are they evidenced by your data? Do they reflect key patterns, but also discrepancies? Do they resonate with your participants? And do they allow you to construct a useful and robust explanation of the phenomenon? I talked about not being on autopilot and being reflexive about your own assumptions involved in it. And a way to do that is through memoing. So memoing refers to writing memos during your data analysis. So it could also be like a sticky note, but qualitative data analysis software has this kind of option in their software to write down your thoughts during the process. So it's about recording the ideas that occur to you as you move through the process of exploring the data. And it facilitates the emergence of new insights, the elaboration of relationships among codes, and theme development. And also it could be a space to be reflexive about how your previous assumptions come in. Let's move to step 3. Here I think in brackets, the authors kind of explain how they came to a certain theme. So it was about step 3 is searching for themes. And the green text shows, they stated the theme was designed to make connections between these concepts and meaningfully interpret the data. So your codes are not your themes. Your themes reflect relationships between your codes. And here in this worked example, you can see how the authors combined a certain codes to come to a theme. Now notice, it is very important, I think, is that the theme is not a summary or a categorization of the codes, such as effects of continuity of care or participant perspectives on continuity of care. And this I see mostly being done in especially people who are new in qualitative research. They often present categories as a theme, but a category to me doesn't say a lot. A theme actually explains something. So here the theme that they came up with was continuity of care supports patient ownership, but is not synonymous with patient ownership. So do you see the difference between this theme and a category such as participant perspectives? Participant perspectives doesn't tell me which perspectives they have, for example. Now, step 4 is about reviewing themes. You may add some subcodes in there. You change the, you see some new relationships between other codes involved. So that is about further refining it. In step 5, you finalize that. And here they came up with their final theme, which they tweaked a little bit compared to step 3 when it was kind of a preliminary search for the themes. So step 4 would be refining it, and then step 5, finalizing this, and also examining the relation with the other themes that maybe allow you even to generate a theoretical framework altogether. And then producing the report on manuscript, but I'm going to leave that to session 3 in the series. This is just an excerpt from the manuscript that the authors came up with, but you'll have a whole session about that. So I will not devote too much attention on that for now. Here again, you can see how rigor comes into the process of being coherent about that your analysis responds to your research question, that you're being reflexive and transparent in this process, that you produce actually themes that resonate with your readers, that they actually make a significant contribution. So here you have all of these elements coming into play. So quality is not a checkbox exercise of a technique that you can simply do. It's about integrating these things in your whole process. You kind of have to breathe trustworthiness throughout the whole qualitative research project from start to end, I would say. Now, maybe something to reassure you. This is a quote from my personal mentor in qualitative research, Anja Krumach. She's a professor at my university. And she once told me, if you don't have the feeling that you're struggling, then you're not doing qualitative data analysis well. And I felt it stuck with me because I think data analysis is one of the most creative phases where you have a lot of freedom as a researcher to construct your findings, but it is also really a struggle. And sometimes you are confused by someone else who says, another participant who said something else. You don't have the overview yet. You'll have too many codes. You're struggling. But actually, that is part of the process. So I would just want to give that to you. So we went through rigor, data collection, data analysis very quickly. And there's, I think I could talk about all of these 3 things for a week each, probably. But let's leave that for another course, perhaps. I just want to come back quickly to the quote from the beginning about the elasticity of a qualitative design that maybe matches also with session 1, where you choose a certain approach, and here also you choose a certain data collection method like interviewing, or you do thematic analysis, So you have this approach that guides you, but you have a lot of freedom of how to do your interview, of how to look at your analysis. So yes, that is, I think, what I mean with the elasticity, which makes it a bit maybe confusing or abstract. But I do hope that with this series, you have some tools to get started and also some further resources. Now, I think I saw some questions in the chat, and I just want to take 1 minute to respond to those. One person asked if you can also use videos for observation. Yes, obviously that is possible, but they may reduce some of the contextual characteristics that are going on. But it is, for example, used a lot in classroom research, where you just have a camera in the classroom or in the simulation lab, for example, and then analyze what is going on. There's even a method called video reflexive ethnography, where you'll actually record a practice that someone does and then look with your participant to that recording to ask for their reflections about it. So you'll have multiple ways of integrating video in qualitative research. And then there's a question about how many interviews do you use for the initial open coding and generating the code book. That's a matter of, there's no one answer to that, I would say. So I see you nodding. It's a matter of your feeling. First step is you familiarize yourself with the whole data set. And maybe if you've done all the interviews yourself, you already have quite good a sense of what's in your data. So then you probably have quite good a feeling of when you've captured some of the main things in your data, perhaps after 3 or 5 transcripts, depending on how big your group is. So that's a little bit, it depends. I think also I teach a qualitative course here in Maastricht for PhD candidates, and our slogan is, it depends. So feel free to contact me also later on if you have any further questions about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for your attention, and yeah, feel free to contact me later on.
Thank you so much, Janneke. Bye.